Whenever a new electric vehicle comes out, or whenever we're trying to decide whether or not our next car should be electric, the conversation almost always starts the same way. We think, how does it compare to a gas car? How long does it take to charge? Or how far does it go? Could I road trip in it? Or how long will the battery actually last? Those all sound like perfectly reasonable questions. I mean, after all, gas cars have been the standard for well over 100 years. So why wouldn't we compare something new to something we've known our entire lives? In fact, if you'd asked me a few years ago, that's exactly where I would have started too. But after making a lot of videos about EV ownership, I started noticing something strange. Every time I thought I had an answer, the comparison itself started to feel like I was missing something. It wasn't because the facts changed or because the premise was all wrong. It was because the comparison that seemed so obvious wasn't always comparing the things that actually mattered. Take charging as an example. The comparison everyone makes first is that an EV takes longer to charge than a gas car takes to fill up. And that's true. There's really no way to argue that. If you drive from North Carolina to Florida every month, stopping for 20 or 30 minutes instead of 5 absolutely changes the experience. Charging speed versus fill-up speed matters when you're deciding what to buy. But here's where the comparison started feeling a little strange to me. Most of us aren't making 800-mile road trips every month. In fact, we're probably not even making 200-mile one-way trips that often. So that's what starts to get interesting, because when we're talking about road trips, we're comparing two ways of getting energy into the car and asking which one of those is faster. When we're talking about everyday life, we're actually comparing two completely different routines instead. Most EV owners don't replace a 5-minute stop at a gas station with a 20-minute stop at a charging station. They replace it with nothing. They pull into the garage, plug the car in, they go inside, and the next morning, the car is ready to go. In that situation, you'd be at home sleeping, watching TV, or playing with your kids anyway. So are we comparing the time it takes to add energy? Or maybe it's the amount of time we spend thinking about energy in the first place. Those aren't the same comparisons, and depending on which one you choose, you can honestly reach two completely different conclusions. That's when I started wondering if this were more than just a charging discussion. Maybe it's more of a comparison problem. For years, one of the most common criticisms of EVs has been battery life. Think about it. Most of us have had a phone battery that slowly got worse over time, and eventually it stops lasting all day long. And so maybe then we replace the battery or we replace the phone. So it's easy to think an EV battery is just the same thing on a much larger scale. But is that really a fair comparison? We almost never compare the battery to the part of the gas car that serves the same role. Almost by default, we compare it to another battery, probably because they're both called batteries, even though they're designed and used in completely different ways. I actually think the better comparison is the engine and transmission. They're the expensive components that largely determine how long a vehicle remains useful. And nobody expects an engine or transmission to last forever. So the question has never been if they'll eventually wear out. The question has always been whether they last long enough that it doesn't matter to most owners. And that's a very different conversation, a very different way to think about it. And it leads to a very different question. What if you thought about EV batteries in relation to engines or transmissions instead? With what the current data shows about how long they typically last, how often they actually fail, and what replacements really cost outside of warranty, there are some real similarities. So comparing the job each component performs instead of comparing two things that happen to share the same name may actually be a better way to think about the role the battery should play when you're deciding whether an EV or a gas car is best for you. Everything mechanical has to be maintained, and maintenance comparisons can fall into the same trap. Someone points out that EVs don't need oil changes. Then someone else points out the tires can cost more. But are we comparing routine maintenance or total ownership cost? Those aren't necessarily the same discussion. And the more I looked, the more I saw that this pattern is everywhere. And then something finally clicked for me. I don't think most arguments about EVs are really arguments about EVs. I think they're arguments about comparisons. We've been comparing the technology instead of comparing the ownership experience. We've been comparing the exception instead of comparing everyday life. I actually chuckled when it hit me that we don't expect a pickup truck to drive like a Corvette. We don't criticize a sports car because it can't haul a family of six. And those vehicles are built for different jobs. But when it comes to EVs, we seem to compare every one of them against an imaginary gas car that somehow does everything. It seems like we're looking for it to be inexpensive, fun to drive, able to tow, reliable, and efficient all at the same time. And that car really doesn't exist. Yet that's often the benchmark we use when we're deciding whether an EV is good enough. Maybe that's why so many conversations never seem to go anywhere. Everyone is using a different measuring stick while believing they're all having the same discussion. And while I was thinking about all of this, I realized something else too. This way of thinking doesn't just apply to EVs anymore. Modern cars are starting to blur the lines too. They receive software updates, they use phone apps, and some use your phone as a key. So they're starting to do more and more of the things we used to think of as EV features. The question isn't becoming, is this an EV feature? The question is becoming, what is the car trying to optimize? And understanding what the car is trying to optimize is usually much more useful than deciding whether it got the answer right. The funny thing is, I started this journey trying to answer whether EVs were better than gas cars. Now, I'm not even sure that's the right question. And the more I've thought about it, the more I realize that's exactly what's been happening over the last year on this channel. Every time I made another video, whether it was about charging every night or fast charging or battery life or navigation, I thought I was answering a different question. Looking back, I don't think I was. I think I've been exploring the same idea from different directions. Not whether EVs are better, but how they actually fit into everyday life. And somewhere along the way, I realized the best way to understand an EV is to ask whether it solves your problem better than the alternatives. So, should we compare EVs to gas cars? Absolutely. Just make sure you're comparing the right things. Because once you stop asking which technology is winning and start asking which ownership experience fits the way we actually live, the decision becomes a whole lot clearer. And that's a comparison that's actually worth making. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work.